David Korevaar, welcome to San Antonio.
Well, it's great to be here, John.
I have really enjoyed your Bach over the years, and I know it's something that musicians we study, and it probably changes over time.
Absolutely. It's been, for me, a really life-changing, maybe. I don't know, do I have life-changing experiences? I guess I have life-changing experiences. So Bach has become very much part of my life, and something that I think I've grown with a lot over the last 20 years.
Well, to me, there are the sources of his scores.
Mm-hmm.
There are sounds of some of the instruments. I guess he sort of like the clavichord would practice different things, but the instruments have changed over the years. How do you approach these sort of things with the quote-unquote historically informed performances?
Well, I think that the whole idea of what historically informed performance has evolved a great deal too, and that's been great fun. I mean, I grew up in the generation when harpsichords still sounded like boneyards, to be really cruel about it. And the modern harpsichord school has been based on the idea of the harpsichord as a beautiful instrument aesthetically, I think. And you hear players now. I've got a colleague at the University of Colorado, Elizabeth Farr, who just makes the harpsichord sound so gorgeous. And to understand that aesthetic is there and that possibility is there is really liberating for those of us who are playing on the piano. And of course, the modern piano isn't a historical instrument for much of the repertoire we play. It's the instrument I play, it's the instrument I want to make sing. So I look at that music then and I try to make it come to life in a way that is quote-unquote historically informed, for sure. I'm very interested in those things, but also to, take advantage of the resources of the instrument I'm playing on.
Yeah. It's one of those things that when you approach his compositions as a whole, you probably, once you've played all the well-tempered clavier and looked into those, that when you look to some of the suites, the French suites and the English suites, it probably maybe changes the perspective a little bit on how you approach Bach in general?
Right. Well, I mean, Bach is... One of the remarkable things about Bach, of course, is how many different styles he wrote in. He was the bringer together of national styles in the 18th century to some extent. And so the partitas, which is what I've just recorded, he's kind of his summing up of the Baroque suite, and he brings together really everything he can. So yes, there's plenty of counterpoint. There are the Gigue from the G major partita is this fantastic, fully worked out double fugue in the form of a Gigue, and that he can do these kinds of things, this sort of technical virtuosity of composition, while still being true to the original dance form is a phenomenal accomplishment of Bach. So of course, you play a piece like that, and it makes you think of some of the fugues in the well-tempered clavier, which are also very Gigue-like. On the other hand, when you're playing the dance music, you want to have some idea of the fact that Bach himself lived in a society where French courtly dance was something people did. The Germans were trying to be civilized, and for them, civilization meant, if you were in a German court, it meant being French. They spoke French. They did the French dances. I mean, it's really interesting to learn that. So when Bach writes a courante, or when Bach writes a sarabande, it's from the point of view of some familiarity with how those things were actually danced. Not that these pieces were intended to be danced, but that they certainly are based on a conception that would involve the physical motions or choreography of the dance.
Yeah. Bach is one of those guys that, whether it's organ, piano, harpsichord, it can be played on the marimba.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That it kind of comes across. And I imagine working in this sort of sound world, it's got to be fun to record these and try to get that particular sound you want for Bach.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And I think that's something, if you listen to pianists who've recorded Bach, I mean, the ones people think of, they all have a perspective on the sound, and I think that's one of the things that I've tried to have as well, is a perspective on the sound. And I think I bring my own ideas to bear on that now very much, that the sound I want is something that's kind of hard to describe, but it's certainly different from how I play Beethoven. Put that stuff in words. Come on, do it. No, it's not so easy to do, and I teach too. You deal with these intangibles with sound, and trying to explain that, and trying to say, well, that's too complicated for Bach, or that's too thick for Bach, or that's too gooey for Bach. I mean, but those kinds of qualifications are pretty hard to pin down. What's the line on gooiness? What's the line on thickness?
Yeah, and it's funny that those sort of things occasionally will change, kind of like hemlines.
Right.
Whether Casals plays Bach and Rostropovich
Right.
plays Bach, and now how someone Edgar Meyer plays Bach on his bass.
Right, exactly. Well, and you mentioned all the string players, and of course, for me, that was such a great inspiration because, again, if you have a kind of sound picture of Bach from when I was younger, pianists tended to approach it in a pretty dry way, and in a pretty rhythmically straightforward way. And I think for me, one of the real eye-openers was hearing cello suites in my teens and then later, and just saying, wait a minute, but that's really different from what any pianist would ever do with those same notes, and why, and it's a good thing, basically. It's like listening to the way a cellist plays one of the sarabands from the suites, and the way the phrasing works, and the way the breathing works. That's been something that's been incredibly important to me in terms of playing this music on the piano, and something which I think that you often miss in keyboard performances.
Yeah. We're speaking with David Korevaar, who has recorded Bach and wonderful Lowell Lieberman. And one of my questions was going to be, when you work with someone like Lowell Lieberman or with composers on faculty there in Colorado, and then return to Beethoven and return to Bach, do those sort of conversations with living composers affect composers of the past?
Of course, because, and I have been known to compose myself, too, although it's been some years since I've done it. I think one of the things we forget as performers, because we start looking at these texts as biblical in a sense, or somehow, we're always looking for original intent, to use a term from another field. These composers were human beings, and they were artists, and they were people who were trying to express something, and they were trying to translate music into black dots on a page, which is something that is imperfect, quite frankly. And a friend of mine, we were having this conversation the other night, he's a conductor, and saying, what people forget is the performer is part of this process too. And composers, when you work with living composers, they're totally aware of that. The performer is part of the process. And that's just as true when you're working with Bach or Beethoven. The performer is still part of the process. You can't simply do what's on the page. That's not sufficient. That's a starting point, but that's not an ending point at all.
Yeah. To me, there are so many wonderful lines, this counterpoint and these harmonies, but the melodies often want to just sing. Are there fun times of trying to figure out the voicing and this and that, for this, particular movement or that particular movement?
I was trying to describe this process to a student, saying that one of the things about Bach's music, and this is particularly true in Bach because it's relatively unmarked in terms of dynamics and articulations. There's very little there to work with. It's mostly just notes and rhythms. You have to actually listen to the music. Now that sounds totally banal, but the point is that when you sit down and play, a lot of people, when they sit down and play, they start right away trying to do something specific. And I think the first step actually has to be to sit down and play and to hear what the music is saying. And it may speak differently to different people, but for me, there's something about just listening to how all the notes combine. And, Bach's contrapuntal pieces for keyboard instruments were written for instruments on which you could not voice, per se. That is, you couldn't bring out a line through volume, which is what pianists do. You brought it out through other techniques. So I also think when I'm playing it on the piano, I want to hear what emerges from the texture, as opposed to trying to say, well, this line is coming out or this line is coming out. I want to hear what line comes out on its own. That's the starting point. A lot of his textures in the dance pieces look like counterpoint on the page, but are actually this kind of fake counterpoint we call style brisé, which is an imitation of French lute style. And it's not about creating, say, a duet of two lines that look like two lines on a page, but rather about actually hearing the way those things end up sounding like melodies and chords. And it's a different thing. It's like when you're playing in the violin music, it gives you one line and you hear slower melodies emerging out of faster notes. On piano, it's almost the opposite sometimes, that we hear the faster notes coming out of the slower melodies. I mean, it's a funny reversal that we deal with.
Oh, yeah. What's next for Bach? What's next for your, what do you want to take a look at?
Well, I don't know, so I've on my Bach projects, I've done the well-tempered clavier. I've recorded the Goldberg variations a few years ago. Now the partitas, and I haven't thought of what the next Bach project is. I know that the Goldbergs came as a surprise to me. That was a project that came about because of a collaboration with my friend Tim Smith, who did a fabulous website for the well-tempered clavier, and now has done one for the Goldbergs as well. And then the partitas was just a labor of love for me. I really wanted to do this. But my next labor of love is going to be late Schubert. So there you go. I've been wanting to do that for a long time. And it's, when I do these things, these are pieces that I've listened to, not necessarily performed a lot. I have a very large repertoire, but sometimes for these projects that I'm thinking of in terms of what I'm going to do next, these are about learning for me. So I'm in the midst right now of learning two of the late Schubert sonatas, the G major, which is the one right before the last three, and it's the one that's not heard all that much actually, but it's to me one of the most fantastic aesthetic statements of Schubert. The first movement of that piece does absolutely nothing for 10 minutes, and it's such a fantastic thing as a matter of aesthetics for that period, that you have a piece that's about creating stillness. And then the C minor, which is kind of the opposite. That's his in a way, almost a tribute to Beethoven in terms of the kinds of aesthetic that he's using there, and a lot of material that seems Beethovenian, almost taken from Beethoven, but treated in a completely different way because it's Schubert.
I always think of those as sort of these Mahler-esque sort of symphonies for piano because they're structurally so interesting and sonically like a symphony to me.
Right. No, it's actually an amazing thing. The only one of those late pieces I've played is the B-flat sonata, which is perhaps the best known, and you have to put yourself in a different place, and it's like Bruckner in a way. It's you work at a different speed. It changes your metabolism, and it's so fantastic. And if you can change your audience's metabolism, I think you've succeeded.
Wow. Well, we'll look forward to that and enjoy the Bach a lot. Thanks, David.
Thank you so much, John.